Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Shubh, and welcome to Marvel Episode 1. So if you listened last episode, I spoke about how, every podcast about movies eventually talks about the Marvel Cinematic Universe in some way, shape, or form. And I wanted to get ahead of it because I'm a big fan of the movies. But recently, during, a slight rewatch, not really like a major rewatch, just a few movies, I realized that these movies have limitations, especially the earlier ones. And I wanted to do like a sort of an overview of the films. So, there's a lot of orders in which you can watch these films, because it's 10 years of movies. You can go by the date of release, but I wanted to go chronologically in terms of the universe's timeline. So I'm starting today with Captain America, which is set in 1942, then to Captain Marvel from the 90s, and then Iron Man's 1 and 2, which are in 2008 and 9, I think. So let's start with the first movie, Captain America, the First Avenger. So the movie's set in 1941, and, obviously the world is in the middle of World War II, the bloodiest conflict in recent history. Steve Rogers, played by Chris Evans for the most part, when he's actually big, wants to do his part and join America's army. But the military rejects him because of his numerous medical conditions, and, on account of his small stature. Eventually Steve gets his chance when he's accepted into an experimental program that turns him into a super soldier, and we then see Chris Evans come into play as Steve Rogers becomes Captain America. Eventually he joins forces with Bucky Barnes, played by Sebastian Stan, and Peggy Carter, played by Hayley Atwell. And fights the Hydra organization, which is basically the Nazi R&D wing. So the director of this film, Joe Johnston, he directed Jurassic Park 3, which is, it's a sequel that's not really appreciated as much as the original Spielberg movies. And it's one of those movies that you can enjoy if you forgive some of the cartoonish aspects. But it's not that much worse than the sequel that Spielberg directed. It's not as good, but it's still not as bad. It's not that much worse. Sorry. And he does the same thing with this film. It's not a good Marvel movie, but it's not bad. It's not as good as its predecessor in terms of origin movies, which is Iron Man, but it's still better than Thor. But it's definitely, let's just say it's definitely better than the Captain America from the 90s. But when you go, when you go back to the characters, you realize that there's not much to them. When Steve Rogers becomes Captain America, half because of the serum, and, also becomes figuratively in the sense that all of the sort of marketing stuff that he has to do in the middle of the movie, takes a toll on him. He eventually, takes it upon himself to go full Rambo on this behind enemy lines mission. And saves 400 Allied force men all too easily. After that, he bands together a few of them in a montage, and they all go to destroy secret weapons factories all over Europe. There's something about time in this movie. Time passes very fast. Because, Steve Rogers goes through that entire phase of, when he's being used as a showgirl, essentially, just as an object of marketing for the military. And that's, over a long time, but it's condensed into a montage. You have this montage as well of Steve Rogers developing a rapport. So you don't really see Captain America fighting as much in this film. But, back to the crew that he assembles, we barely meet them beyond just their accents. There's someone who's from England, someone who's French, there's probably an Australian in there. Without a background understanding of the Howling Commandos franchise, you might think of it as a sort of, the corporate universalization tactic, appeal to a broader audience. It feels like a reminder that World War II wasn't won just by America, and it was a joint effort. And it shows that Captain America himself is not a solitary hero. He's just the leader amongst them. But in this film, Red Skull is probably the best character in the film. And it's become a common sort of occurrence in that era of superhero filmmaking, especially in the shadow of Heath Ledger's Joker. You have, but even though the man who plays Red Skull, I forget his name, is good to watch. He's putting on a Werner Herzog impression, and it doesn't do justice to the impression to do a character with such two-dimensional motivations. There needs to be something deeper in the dialogue, especially when you're doing a Herzog impression. But the worst of it is when it comes to the romance with Peggy Carter, played by Hayley Atwell. Mostly Hayley Atwell is just there as the sort of sexualized object that shows sort of affection towards Steve Rogers, even when he's small, to prove that it's more than just an attraction. Even then, as soon as he steps out of the booth, you see her. But regardless, it doesn't matter. But, she's not filmed well. There's a lot of close-ups to sort of imply that there's a relationship building, but I don't buy any of it. I don't buy the relationship being built between Peggy Carter and Captain America. And, the whole love triangle, Howard Stark, Cap, and Peggy thing, it didn't work for me. It just felt like we were just supposed to accept this story because she's the only female character written into this plot. There's also the question of the fact that Chris Evans and Hayley Atwell don't seem to have the chemistry at this point as they did in the later Marvel movies. But even then, there's no real emotion felt, to be honest. This movie starts and ends in the ice, and that's not a spoiler because it starts and ends in the same place. You know where it's headed, and the other place it's headed is as sort of the most expensive marketing campaign for the Avengers movie, and that's where the problem lies. That's where the complaint is. Movies like these origin movies should hold up on their own, the way Iron Man did, especially in the beginning of the MCU. You see these movies are clearly building up to something, but that something is completely sort of being distorted in terms of a message. Eventually, you watch the Avengers and you realize that this is necessary storytelling to understand what causes the divide and then ultimate cohesion in the team. But, like I said last week, there's something in storytelling in terms of movies that they can't achieve like they do in comics, and that's the stories in between. I would have loved to see some more Howling Commandos, for example, where we get to know their characters more than just their skin colors and their accents. But you could say that the film's sort of heroic, old school feeling is its biggest asset, but it's also its biggest shortcoming. Because on one hand, it's fun to see a superhero that does the right thing for doing the right thing's sake, but despite that, it does make sometimes it does make the characters feel sort of two-dimensional. The symbols are so obviously clear. There's an American flag in the shape of a man fighting the literal face of the devil, like he has a red skull. It's the most evil icon that I can think of. Right there's a total, complete sort of unawareness of the irony and of itself. And it's best on display in the scene where Rogers and Bucky are at the World's Fair, which is a precursor to the Stark Expo and Iron Man 2. But even that causes the movie to sort of stray on the side of irrelevance in terms of old-fashionedness. And you can hear that in the dialogue in that scene. But still, for the most part, Captain America is a good and entertaining film. It doesn't ask for much except for you to just sit back and watch. You don't have to think much about it. It's like a necessary sort of prequel to everything that happens later. It's not even Captain America's most defining moments. And at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's an expensive commercial for the future of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It has a nod in its title. It's called Captain America: The First Avenger, as in it is a prequel to the Avengers. And for all of its minor issues, you end up liking Steve Rogers and rooting for his, do the right thing sort of vibe. Anyway, stay tuned. We'll be back with Captain Marvel.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the first Marvel episode. We just spoke about Captain America: The First Avenger. Up next, we're going to talk about Captain Marvel. So, Captain Marvel, it's basically a political commercial. It packs it's got a pretty strong message, but it's not really an experience aesthetically. The message of its film is conveyed not as much through the story, but through things like its casting, and the message around that, and the film itself, being the second major studio-backed film about a female superhero. But implicitly, it's more than just about representation. It's also about the redistribution of power. There are obviously some secondary, but obviously significant messages in the film as well, but for the most part, the movie's trivial about these. Its significance is really just as like a foundational stepping stone for movies to come. So in this film, Brie Larson plays Veers, who is a Kree warrior from a distant galaxy centered on the planet Hala. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Kree race. They've been going on in this sort of age-old war with the Skrulls. So Veers loses her memory in the battle that she also gets her superpowers in. So she doesn't know who she is. And she tries to piece together her identity from a few, disjointed recollections. It's the same premise as Alita Battle Angel, essentially. She's haunted by nightmares that tell her to let go of the past, but she's also remanded by this guy Yanrog, who's her mentor, she refers her to the AI system called the Supreme Intelligence, where after being surrounded by a pod filled with blue tentacles and teleported into a dream world, she sees the person haunting her in her dreams, a character played by Annette Bening, and she tells Veers to put the needs of the Kree people above the needs of herself. Veers, she's her main weapon is her fists, because they're hot, they glow, and they shoot out photon blasts. So, for example, when she gets captured by the Skrulls, she blasts a hole through their spaceship and crash lands on Earth into a Blockbuster video store, the home of the 90s nostalgia in this film. That's when we figure out that it's set in 95. She goes into this Blockbuster, picks up a True Lies, and it introduces a bunch of nostalgia figures into the plot, like Radio Shack, dial-up internet, CD-ROMs, pagers, Nine Inch Nails, Nirvana, REM. But the most significant of these is the cinematic effect of nostalgia, the cinematic nostalgia, which comes straight from the presence of this blockbuster. This action is set in a time before superhero movies were the norm. This is before the MCU. And the movie places Veers, or Carol Danvers as she figures out she is, as the sort of mother of the entire thing. Because she is ultimately the strongest of them all. Anyway, in this parking lot, she gets into a showdown with Nick Fury, who's been de-aged. Samuel L. Jackson plays him. She explains who she is in her battle with the Skrulls, and eventually finds out her identity is Carol Danvers. She was nicknamed Avenger, which is a huge nod towards the rest of the franchise, and was part of this sort of joint Air Force and NASA team that included Dr. Wendy Lawson, who is played by Annette Bening and is the face of Carol Danvers' nightmares. Fragments of her identity appear here and there. There's scenes of frustration, and all of it eventually leads up to her seeing a montage in the climax when she's at her lowest to sort of motivate her to get back up. And she does that. That's the film. She falls down and she gets back up and she defeats her goal, her enemy. This identity recovery it's not done with any curiosity, it's not done with any sort of interest. The movie, it just reduces Carol into this one dimension of her being a fighting machine whose only remembered events are moments of struggle and overcoming these struggles. It's a very reductive way of making and conceiving this character, and it just fits too well with the political fiction on the basis of this movie. the only aspect to her character is this sort of lifelong struggle of overcoming, all the odds in a world filled with men. And that's all that's known of her. And more significantly, in terms of the character, all that the character needs to know about herself in order to continue. I mean, you can't have the most powerful superhero in a universe and also give them a very one-dimensional personality, because that way we don't have anything to clutch onto, we don't have anything to root for. That's why I was very glad to hear that the creative team was switched up for the Captain Marvel sequel, because I feel like Captain Marvel can be a very incredible series, and it can be the gateway into space for the MCU. Eventually in the film, Carol discovers that the Kree faked their sort of war with the Skrulls, and the Skrulls aren't really evil or terrorists. They're actually refugees that have been displaced from their homelands by the Kree. Carol realizes that she was being presumptive, and claims legitimacy to the Skrull narrative of it all, and decides to return to the battle, not to end it, not to end the war, not to win, but to end the lies, as she says. And that's where the political positioning of this film becomes clear, They're fighting against a force that wants to, quote-unquote, protect their borders. But still, there's other elements. When Yonrog tells Veers that she should be wary of her own temperament, saying that nothing is more dangerous to a warrior than emotion, the movie proves otherwise. Veers realizes that her emotions, they don't inhibit her ability as a warrior, but they're actually the strength, the source of her strength and sort of moral virtue. But it's not about endorsing or depicting emotion like that. Captain Marvel, it filters. Basically, it's about the movie. It only allows Carol to feel feelings that are productive. There has to be a frustration at failure. There has to be an anger at insult. There's always a logic to her emotion. There's no natural human bias. Let's say she's just always doing the right thing. There's no edge that makes her feel human. Anna Boden and Ryan Fleck, who are the directors, didn't do as much in this film as they've proved in their other smaller projects. Their direction is slow, but it's paced up by a very quick editing, and it results in this sort of very jumpy feel that drops very significant moments with a feeling of casual sort of nonchalance, let's say, because, it rewards multiple viewings in the sense that unless you watch it with a very keen sort of academic eye, you're not going to notice any of the hints that it drops. And it makes watching the movie laborious. Like, I fell asleep during the second act, I'm not going to lie. I woke back up when the Skrulls came because I love the fact that they're Australian. I think that's the best detail in the entire film. Ultimately, the message of Captain Marvel is, like most movies of its form, it's a pure and classical idea about how someone who's good at something learns to become virtuous and good, without sacrificing their integrity. There's a lot of dramatic potential, but that's what makes this mal-execution so disappointing, because it's just another reminder that the problem with superhero movies is not the source material but the execution. The problem comes from the culture and the structures of corporate interest in these movies, and the fact that they can't bet big on high risks because that's a lot of money. But there's nothing we can do about that. We'll take a break here. We'll be back with the Iron Man 1 and Iron Man 2. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. We just spoke about Captain America, the First Avenger, and Captain Marvel. But now we're going to talk about the movie that started it all. The first of the Marvel movies, in 2008, the MCU, before it was actually the MCU, took a huge risk in launching what became one of the best Marvel movies in history, Iron Man, which is Jon Favreau's 2008 blockbuster. Iron Man, it didn't just catapult Robert Downey Jr. into incredible fame, but also it paved the way for superhero movies of its kind, which is impressive for a time where the box office wasn't as saturated with superhero movies as it is now. With most superhero movies, all you get is sort of the surface. There's an illusion, you can see it, but you can't see through it. With Iron Man, you get a glimpse into the depths. You can get the feeling, for example, of, functioning workplace relationships, whether it be the characters of Pepper Potts, played by Gwyneth Paltrow, who is Stark's loyal aide, and Obadiah Stane, who's played by Jeff Bridges, Stark's business partner and eventually nemesis. These characters feel natural. They feel like they've known each other for a long time. That workplace camaraderie, the relationships they've built, they're evident. And that's mostly because these actors are just incredible. I mean, Gwyneth Paltrow, Iron Man's played by Robert Downey Jr., Jeff Bridges is incredible. But, like most comic book heroes now, Iron Man wasn't as big of a name. He wasn't a household name. He certainly wasn't on any Wheaties packets. Before this movie came out. There was a sort of slightly ambitious cartoon series in the 90s, but even then, audiences who didn't read the comics before weren't really familiar with the significance of Iron Man and the extended Marvel universe. But this film was the launching pad, and it was integral in the master plan that Kevin Feige had to make the behemoth that is Marvel Studios today. The film had a lot to carry on its shoulders. It was an origin story for a character, but also for an entire 10 years of filmmaking. It was intended to be a one-part sort of standalone, but it laid the groundwork for a much larger universe, not only for its own character, but much farther beyond. The plot of the film, not very extraordinary, but it gained success because Robert Downey Jr. is the backbone of Iron Man. His performances are what make these movies incredible. Unlike other superheroes, Robert Downey Jr. added depth to Tony Stark, and, you can see very familiar aspects to their personality. He spoke about this on a podcast. It seemed like the right thing for him to do at the time. To this day, Robert Downey Jr. has been the key to the MCU. He's been seen as the most integral part of the entire sort of run, and he makes the biggest sacrifice at the end. He also made $80 million off of Infinity War. And that's just on the back end, if I'm not mistaken. But, to understand this, we have to understand the character. Iron Man was created in 1963. He was one of the founding members of the Avengers, and his popularity grew in the comic book world. But outside that, again, Favreau, all he had to do was prove to a completely much wider audience that this is a character that they can back. And a lot of that feeling is because of the chemistry that I mentioned, between Robert Downey Jr., between Gwyneth Paltrow, Jeff Bridges. These relationships seem fully formed, and they last throughout the whole movie. You feel terribly betrayed when you realize that Obadiah Stane is behind the sinister plot of the evil aspect of this movie. Obadiah Stane, the betrayal hits so hard because he doesn't just come up to the camera and just say he's a villain in like some long, drawn-out monologue, which he does eventually, but, I can't say it. He didn't, at least in the beginning, it was shown through a very slick montage. And, between Pepper and Stark, there's the tension of a will they, won't they situation. But it's really Robert Downey Jr.'s performance that's intriguing and very unexpected, especially at the time. He didn't act like most people play superheroes. He didn't have that sort of weight and effect of responsibility on his shoulders, partly because of the thing that the character goes through, and we see that continue in the arc. But you can sense a freedom there, because Downey is allowed to think and talk and act the way he does, even when he's like playing around with screens in the air. He's so comfortable with his lines that he can pull them out as if they're really honestly natural. And the screenplay, it seems to be dictated by Robert Downey Jr.'s persona. It feels like a project that was perfectly tailored for him. There are certain phrases that people can say on screen. There are certain lines that stick. But sometimes you aim and you miss. But even then, Robert Downey Jr. in this film, he wouldn't get away with saying this sort of weighty, profound statement. Especially on this type of movie. But Tony Stark isn't like that. He talks in such a natural manner. Iron Man, the movie and Tony Stark, they both know that you're not supposed to they both know how seriously superhero movies take themselves. And, if the wit and the dialogue is not in sort of clever lines, but more of a natural sort of realistic situational humor. And we love Stark because that's what he is. He's one bad day away from a breakdown because he keeps a very casual face on the outside. He's a broken man on the inside. It's important that Robert Downey Jr. Is placed as the main source of wit because, the other secondary characters don't seem to try to one-up him. It's really his movie. Gwyneth Paltrow's performance as Pepper Potts is just very believable as a very concerned person over, frankly, a crazy person who's obsessed with making his life count at the end of the day. Jeff Bridges and Obadiah Stane, they're just him in that character. It's the greatest financial villain of all time. He makes us scared about even a stock price change. And Terrence Howard, I think, I don't know if he could have pulled off what Don Cheadle did in the future, but I would have loved to have seen it. I really enjoyed his performance. And another thing is that the movie is not about a conspiracy, or it's not like a spy organization that Iron Man has to fight against. It's the reality of the world, It's about how crazy the military industrial complex is. It's about how weapons are essentially funding so much of bureaucracy. In most movies about superheroes, you'd be watching a story about creating the perfect weapon. But this is a movie where the superhero wants to disarm. It makes him a rational superhero, one that can think and draw moral conclusions rather than just one who seems like a sort of hollow robot mannequin for the platitudes of what one deems to be correct. Obviously, a lot of this movie is about special effects, because of the robotic suits. If it wasn't for these actors, those suits would have taken over. That would have been the most important things. But, it's important how these sort of suits also represent the personalities of the men inside them. Everything they do is obviously obnoxiously crazy, but they seem to be doing it, not the suits. It seems to be Obadiah Stane versus Tony Stark. But even then, a lot of these big budget movies seem to abandon their stories with, in the last act. And they just throw effects at the audience to, wow them. But this one has a plot that works so well that it doesn't matter how big the explosions are and how cool he looks doing them. It's inspiration to provide Tony with the device that saves him. He's not just vulnerable because his nemesis might destroy him, but also because he might destroy himself. And he has to find a cure. But it leaves us with the fundamental question at the bottom. Why must the ultimate weapon be of a human description? Why does it have to have 2 arms and 2 legs? Why does it matter? In these competitions in the world where we have fights with technology and armaments, showing who has the bigger arsenal. Everything about it is based on the understanding of how well they will attack the enemy. Our weapons in real life aren't about being humanoid. Is that the message that it's trying to send? But, obviously it's about aesthetic pleasure. It's a cinematic tool, There has to be a reason for these, and it's basically to symbolize the fact that this cold gray metal is the bad guy, and the cool gold and red, the colors of, sports cars and, well, just essentially coolness in this movie at least. They symbolize something very, very basic to understand. And at the end of the day, it's really just Robert Downey Jr.'s performance that powers this movie and pushes it against other superhero movies. It's proof that you hire actors for their strengths, and Robert Downey Jr. definitely showed them all. He's good in this movie because he's smart, he's quick, he's funny, and because we know that his public persona masks his own very private wounds. And by building on that similar idea, Jon Favreau makes this movie propelled beyond its peers. Anyway, let's take a break there. We'll be back with Iron Man 2.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. We just spoke about Captain America, the First Avenger, Captain Marvel, and Iron Man. Finally, for the fourth movie of the chronology so far, we have Iron Man 2. Now, Iron Man 2 was the first sequel in the MCU, and it provided the sort of linchpin connection to the Avengers initiative that was being assembled. You know, Nick Fury hinted at it in the end credits of the first Iron Man, but, you know, that was before end credit scenes were a thing, unless Ferris Bueller is your favorite movie. So I doubt anyone really stayed to see that, except for really devout fans. You know, over the course of Iron Man 2, we learn more about S.H.I.E.L.D. and its members. We are introduced to Natasha Romanoff, who is the Black Widow, and Phil Coulson, who is a fan favorite. He also returns in Iron Man 2. There's a very funny scene where Coulson threatens to tase Stark if Stark tries to leave his home. But before Coulson gets a chance to tase Stark, he's reassigned to deal with something that's happening in New Mexico, which is, well, Thor. And that's what we learn at the end credit scene of Iron Man 2. You know, there was a hammer found in New Mexico, and Coulson was tasked to recover it. That's Thor. Other memorable scenes are, you know, Tony Stark talking to Nick Fury and Nat Romanoff at Randy's Donuts, which is famous. Iron Man and War Machine take on some drones. There's an appearance from Howard Stark. There's a touching father and son moment, which, you know, is a killer for me. I really enjoy those. And Iron Man 2 is full of really wonderful character-driven scenes. You know, there's a focus on character depiction, which is what makes the villains pretty much as interesting. Well, okay, not really that interesting. Not the villains, at least. But, you know, Iron Man and his development. There's three antagonists. You know, Senator Stern, Justin Hammer, and Ivan Vanko, Whiplash. Justin Hammer is a technocrat, but, you know, he's basically like the antithesis of Tony Stark. He's all talk, no delivery. And Vanko he's an interesting character, you know, because he's been shaped by Howard Stark his whole life, because he grew up in frankly poor conditions because of Howard Stark. And ultimately, Iron Man 2, it's like a well-polished, well-functioning machine of a sequel. You know, it's not as good as the original, but it builds on the quirky performance from Robert Downey Jr. and the fact that, you know, that acting is there, it takes it to another level. Robert Downey Jr., he gives us a cockier and more egotistical Tony Stark, and this is really sort of the peak of his arrogance and, you know, the lowest part of his arc over the trilogy. And he, you know, has a fatal flaw, and that is that he's dying. You know, the megalomania comes naturally when you're dying, but it's also useful as a cover-up. You know, there's a chest-mounted battery source that is running low and poisoning his blood, and it works with the only element that doesn't exist on the planet. Now, to fix himself, he'd have to invent a new element. Not very easy. So Tony goes through this movie sort of as he's approaching death and what comes next. In a reference to Captain America 1, there's the Tony Stark's World Fair, the Stark Expo, and he flies in the suit and promises world peace. And the arena is like when Steve Jobs was announcing the iPad. You know, but obviously Justin Hammer, his arch rival, is planning an army of rivals, iron suits. There's a Congress committee headed by Senator Stern, played by the late, great Gary Shandling. Gary Shandling is an incredible man, and he brings truth to this role. What little of it that he has in this film, he's incredible. He wants Stark to become, he wants Iron Man basically to become property of the U.S. Defense Department. And in Russia, Vanko believes that Iron Man is a secret stolen from his own father. Ultimately, after a bunch of Formula 1 driving and stuff, Justin Hammer hires Vanko to design a better suit. The two suits go to war. We get this incredible half hour of special effects, and that's it. But you also have Scarlett Johansson, who plays a very sexualized version of her character in this film. And Rhodey, played by Don Cheadle. Now, the introduction to Don Cheadle, it's fantastic. All he does, he walks in, he says, "Look, it's me, I'm here, deal with it." And that sets the tone for, the replacement of Don Cheadle with Terrence Howard. But, as I said earlier, I wish I got to see Terrence Howard try to pull some of this off. Because, he in the first one, he looks at the War Machine suit, what becomes the War Machine suit, and he says, maybe next time. But we never get to see that next time. But the best CGI sequence in this film is when Tony decides to drive his own Formula 1 car in Monaco, and Ivan Vanko just stands in the middle of the race and whips a bunch of cars and slices them into like two and all that kind of stuff. It's a very exciting scene. And Mickey Rourke does all that he can with Ivan Vanko. His performance is mostly just flashing his gold teeth and saying "man" and "bort." But it's really Sam Rockwell who takes the cake. His performance as Hammer, who is this sort of just whiner, and is completely in over his head, is just incredible. It's like the best part of this film for me. The movie, the script, even though it's penned by the same person who wrote Tropic Thunder, lacks that sort of rhythm that you find in a dialogue where everything sort of fits. But still, the dialogue in this film was sort of fast-paced, and it supported Downey's improvisations and, scenes with Rhodey and Hammer. They're really, really fun. But then there's also the case of Mickey Rourke. He just came off of an Oscar nomination for The Wrestler. And he infamously, he came to Jon Favreau with a list of ideas for Anton Vanko, including the bird. And eventually most of that ended up on the floor of the editing rooms. In hindsight, it feels like there were just too many ideas involved in Iron Man 2. And they were all being catered by a direction team that just wanted to please all of the voices. It felt directionless a little bit, but it also allowed for each actor to imbue their character with strong and memorable personalities. It's something that the MCU continued. It's giving their secondary characters meatier aspects in the story. Iron Man 2 is full of actors who could all steal the scene. Even the supporting players, there's Jon Favreau, Gwyneth Paltrow, Gary Shandling, Scarlett Johansson, Samuel L. Jackson. These are all incredible actors. And it eventually felt like a sort of collaboration in a Monty Python sort of definition of it, rather than a singular voice throughout the whole film. And that's, what made Tropic Thunder feel really great and, do really well, but it didn't really work that way in Iron Man 2 because the comedy isn't in service of the film. It's really just in service of the joke. Iron Man 2, it's still never less than anything entertaining, let's say. It's got incredible action set pieces like the Grand Prix, Iron Man and War Machine's battle against the drones. But most of it, and the initial positive reception of this film, has really softened over the years. Particularly since, movies have gotten better, because this is the comic book adaptation of Tony Stark's sort of demons, but it's sad that we never got to see sort of elements of stories like Demon in the Bottle. Again, this movie also just feels like an advertisement for future movies. But, that's just the root of the problems of the Marvel Cinematic Universe at the end of the day. There's hints of Tony Stark's addictive personality here, but it's not just alcohol that he's addicted to. It's his addiction to being Iron Man. It's the inability to distinguish himself from the armor. And he states that at the Senate hearing. He takes really wild and unnecessary risks, and he always puts people around him in danger. And it all comes from being drunk on the sense of invincibility that comes with being wrapped around in a gold titanium ally all the time. Iron Man 2 is a sequel. It directed by Jon Favreau again. It gets the job done. But since both movies essentially follow the same arc, there's not very many surprises. But that's just my thing. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. You can also follow us on Twitter at GSMC_movies. Thank you for listening. This has been Shubh Nanda, and stay tuned for the next installment of this Marvel series.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.